The clatter of dishes filled the small kitchen as I scrubbed at a stubborn stain. My fingers wrinkled from the soapy water. My body ached from exhaustion, but there was no time to rest. I had barely stepped inside after a grueling day at work when Alex's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Bring me some tea. Now." I paused, my hands still submerged in the sink. My back was already sore from standing, but I knew better than to complain. "Hold on, I'm doing the dishes," I replied, my voice cautious. His scoff was immediate, laced with irritation. "Stop that, and bring me the tea quickly. Can't you follow simple orders?" I opened my mouth to argue, but before I could form a sentence, another voice joined in. "What a useless wife you are." Mrs. Whitmore. She lounged comfortably in the living room, a slice of cake balanced on her plate, her eyes cold as they flicked toward me. "Make me some sweet coffee while you're at it," she added, her voice dripping with condescension. I sighed, glancing at the pile of dirty dishes and the mess in the kitchen that still needed to be cleaned. There were so many things to do, yet none of it seemed to matter. "Leave those for later," Alex snapped. "Just do what we say." Useless wife. The words clung to me like a second skin. No matter what I did, how hard I tried, it was never enough. I had become a ghost in my own home, my presence acknowledged only when they needed something. I was Naomi, 28 years old, a mother, a full-time employee, and yet, I was nothing more than a servant in this house. 5 years ago, I had married Alex believing in the promise of love and companionship. Instead, I had walked straight into a prison. The decision to move in with his parents had never been mine. It was disguised as an act of responsibility. Mrs. Whitmore needed care after her husband's passing. But I soon realized that I was never meant to be a daughter-in-law in this house. I was meant to be the unpaid maid. I worked long hours at my job, only to return home and continue working. Cooking, cleaning, tending to my son, handling errands, every single task fell on my shoulders. And yet, every meal I made was either picked apart or left untouched. "The stir-fry is so half-hearted," Mrs. Whitmore scoffed one evening, barely glancing at the plate I had placed before her. "I had a long day. I just made something simple," I explained, keeping my tone even. She snorted. "That's why I hate backtalk from a daughter-in-law. Cook properly from scratch." I had dared to push back once, asking why she didn't cook herself if she was such an expert. Her response was swift and brutal. "Why should I? You're here for that." Her words, her tone, everything about her exuded entitlement. And Alex? He never defended me. He never once told her to stop. If anything, he had become an extension of her cruelty. At first, it was the words, the dismissive tone, the way they would talk about me, as if I wasn't even in the room. But then it grew worse. The silence. There were days when neither of them acknowledged my presence at all, except when they needed something. I had gone from being criticized to being completely erased. I told myself I could endure it for my son, that my sacrifices would be worth it if he had a stable home. But the truth was, this wasn't a home. It was a battlefield where I was the only one unarmed. And tonight, as Alex barked orders at me while I scrubbed at pots and pans, I realized something. I had become invisible, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could live this way. I used to believe in love. At 23, when I stood at the altar beside Alex, I was filled with hope. I had imagined a life of partnership, of laughter, of building a home together. I had been naive. I had believed in the warmth of his touch, the softness of his voice when he had promised to take care of me. But 5 years had passed since that day, and all that remained of those promises was an empty shell. In the beginning, I had tried. I woke up early every morning, making his favorite breakfast. I worked long hours at my job, only to return home and cook elaborate dinners, hoping that maybe, just maybe, tonight would be the night Alex would look at me with kindness instead of indifference. But no matter what I did, my efforts were never acknowledged, let alone appreciated. "You use too much salt. This is too dry. Did you even try?" I had swallowed those words, forcing myself to believe that things would get better. That if I just worked harder, if I proved myself, they would see my worth. But worth, in this house, was measured only by obedience. And I was never obedient enough. Mrs. Whitmore made sure of that. Clean the floors before you leave for work. Why haven't you ironed Alex's shirts yet? You're his wife. Do your job properly. Somewhere along the way, my identity had dissolved into nothingness. I wasn't Naomi anymore. I was just an extension of their needs. But tonight, something in me cracked. It started at dinner. I had come home exhausted, my head pounding from a long day at work. Still, I pushed through the fatigue and made a full meal: mapo tofu, fried chicken, a stir-fry with bell peppers and pork. I set the table, my fingers trembling from exhaustion. Alex sat down, barely glancing at the food. Bring me the mayo. No, please. No, thank you. No acknowledgement that I had just spent an hour in the kitchen. I silently handed it to him, forcing myself to swallow the resentment building inside me. Make me some tea, Mrs. Whitmore added lazily from her chair in the living room. I took a deep breath, willing myself to stay calm. Can I finish my meal first? She turned her head slowly, eyes narrowing. Excuse me? I said. Forget it. You have no respect, she snapped. Clean the toilet after this, too. It stinks. I froze, my fork clattering onto my plate. Now? I asked, disbelief creeping into my voice. Yes, now, she said, her tone dripping with condescension. Or, do you need an invitation? Something inside me shattered. I looked at her. I looked at Alex, who was eating without a care in the world, not even glancing up to see what was happening. I looked at the plate in front of me, the meal I had spent time making, only to be treated like a servant. And for the first time in 5 years, I refused to stay silent. Do you even hear yourselves? My voice shook, but I didn't stop. I work all day. I come home, cook, clean, take care of my son, and I don't even get to sit down for 5 minutes before you start barking orders at me. The room fell silent. Alex slowly set his fork down. Are you seriously throwing a tantrum right now? A tantrum? I let out a bitter laugh. You two treat me like I'm invisible, like I'm nothing more than a maid. And I've taken it for 5 years, but I'm done. I am done. Mrs. Whitmore scoffed. Oh, listen to her. The ungrateful wife finally found her voice. Alex leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. If you don't like it, leave. No one's stopping you. The words were meant to be a threat, a reminder that I had no power in this house. But instead, they rang through me like a challenge. Maybe I would. The thought was sudden, terrifying, exhilarating. I had spent years convincing myself that I had no choice, that I had to endure this for the sake of my son. But what was I really teaching him? That love was suffering? That marriage was servitude? That his mother's happiness didn't matter? No. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat in the dark with my son asleep beside me, listening to the silence of the house. The walls felt smaller than ever, pressing in on me, suffocating me. I reached for my phone with trembling fingers and searched for what I had never dared to before. Divorce papers. I stared at the screen, the weight of the decision sinking in. If I took this step, there would be no going back. But as I thought of the years wasted, the endless nights crying in the bathroom so no one would hear me, the way my son looked up at me with worry when I was too exhausted to smile, I knew the choice had already been made. I was leaving. The glow of my phone screen illuminated the dark room as I stared at the words on the screen. Divorce petition. My hands trembled as I downloaded the form, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it echo in my ears. This was it. The first real step toward freedom. I had spent years trapped in this house, suffocating under their control, convincing myself that I had no way out. But tonight, the illusion shattered. I wasn't powerless. I filled out the form slowly, carefully, my fingers gripping the pen with determination. With every box I checked, every line I signed, I felt a weight lifting off my chest. For the first time in years, I was making a decision for myself. No more waiting. No more hoping things would change. I was leaving. The next morning, I walked into the living room, my heart steady, my hands gripping the papers tightly. Alex was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone as if he didn't have a care in the world. Mrs. Whitmore sat beside him, sipping her tea, already prepared to start her usual routine of criticism. I didn't give them the chance. I stepped forward and slammed the divorce papers onto the table. The sharp sound cut through the air, like a gunshot. Alex barely glanced at them. "What's this?" "You know exactly what it is," I said, my voice firm. "I'm filing for divorce." His head snapped up, eyes narrowing. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "You? Divorce?" He scoffed, shaking his head. "You're not serious." I crossed my arms, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I am." The amusement on his face faded. "You think you can just walk away?" His voice was low, dangerous. "Where are you going to go? How will you survive?" I had expected this, his arrogance, his disbelief. He had spent years making me feel small, weak. But I wasn't that woman anymore. "I've been surviving without your help for years," I said calmly. "I work, I earn, I take care of our son. The only difference now is that I won't be doing it while being treated like garbage." His expression darkened, his fists clenching. "You're making a mistake." Mrs. Whitmore slammed her teacup down, her face twisting with rage. "You ungrateful wretch," she hissed. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? You think you're better than us now? Who do you think you are?" I turned to her, my voice unwavering. "I think I'm someone who finally realized she deserves better." She let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "You'll regret this. You won't last a day without us. You're just an emotional little girl playing pretend, thinking you can handle the real world." I stared at her, absorbing every insult, every desperate attempt to shake me. And for the first time I felt nothing. No pain. No anger. No fear. Just clarity. "I'd rather struggle on my own than live another day as your puppet," I said quietly. Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Alex's face was unreadable, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the armrests of the couch. Mrs. Whitmore's nostrils flared, her hands trembling in fury. And me? I felt lighter than I had in years. The tension in the house was unbearable after that. Alex barely spoke to me, but when he did, it was dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, look, the independent woman's still making my dinner. You sure you can handle life without a husband? You could barely keep this house clean." Mrs. Whitmore was worse, her insults more venomous, her glares sharper. But none of it mattered, because I was no longer trying to please them. I no longer cared what they thought. Every time I looked at those divorce papers, I knew I was finally taking my life back. The realization hit me like a slap in the face. I had always known I was the one keeping this house running, physically, emotionally, financially, but I had never let myself truly acknowledge the weight of it. Until now, I was the breadwinner. Not Alex. Not his mother. Me. Every meal on this table, every bill paid, every necessity taken care of, it was all because of my income. And yet, they had treated me like I was disposable, like I was the one who needed them. But the truth was they needed me. That night at dinner, Alex leaned back in his chair, his usual smirk in place. "So, Naomi," he drawled, stabbing at his food. "Have you thought about how you'll survive after the divorce?" Mrs. Whitmore snorted, taking a slow sip of her tea. "She can barely keep a house, let alone her own life. She won't last a week." I didn't even blink. I calmly set my fork down, looking directly at Alex. "I've been supporting this family for years. I think I'll be just fine." Silence. For the first time, Alex had nothing to say. His smirk faltered, his grip tightening around his fork. Mrs. Whitmore scoffed. "What nonsense. We don't need your pity money." But the way Alex avoided my gaze told a different story. I let my words sink in, watching as the truth clawed at them. Without my paycheck, their carefully built world would collapse. Later that night, I walked past the living room and froze. Low voices. Whispers. I stayed hidden just outside the doorway, my heart pounding as I heard my name. "She can't leave us like this," Alex hissed. "She won't," Mrs. Whitmore replied, her voice cold and calculated. We'll make her life so miserable she won't dare to leave. A chill ran down my spine. They didn't care about me. Not as a wife. Not as a daughter-in-law. Not even as the mother of their own grandson. It was never about family. Never about love. It was about control. It was about money. And now that I was walking away, they were panicking. Good. Let them panic. I laid in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. If they wanted a battle, they would get one. But I wouldn't fight with words. I wouldn't waste my breath on pointless arguments. I would hit them where it hurt the most, their pride and their pockets. I had spent years bending over backward for them, making sure they were comfortable, financially stable, well-fed. And in return, they had treated me like I was nothing. That ends now. I would cut them off. No more food on the table they didn't appreciate. No more money slipping into their pockets without them realizing it. No more power over me. They thought they could break me. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The morning after overhearing their conversation, I made the call. A crisp voice answered. This is Rachel Ford. How can I help you? I took a deep breath. I need a divorce, I said, my voice steady. And I want to make sure they don't get a penny more than they deserve. There was a pause, then a slight hum of approval. You're the breadwinner, aren't you? Yes. Good, she said. That gives us an advantage. But we need to build a solid case. She laid it out clearly. Document everything. Financial records proving I paid for everything, from the mortgage to the groceries to my son's school supplies. Audio recordings of their insults, their neglect, their casual cruelty. Witnesses, neighbors, coworkers, even the daycare staff who had seen how they treated me. Get me all of this, Rachel said. And I'll make sure you leave with what's yours. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a weapon. I moved carefully. Every receipt, every bank statement, I copied and stored them in a hidden folder. I started keeping my phone nearby, recording snippets of conversations when their voices dripped with cruelty. You're useless. Click. No one else would put up with you. Click. You're lucky we let you stay. Click. I didn't react when they said these things anymore. I just let them dig their own graves. I endured their taunts, their demands, their cold stares. But I was no longer trapped. I was preparing. Then Mrs. Whitmore changed tactics. Suddenly, she started acting nice. One evening, as I was setting the table, she walked into the kitchen with an artificial softness in her voice. Naomi, dear, why don't we put all this divorce nonsense behind us? I didn't answer. She sighed dramatically. I know I've been tough on you, but we're family, aren't we? I turned and met her gaze unflinching. Family doesn't treat each other the way you've treated me. Her expression flickered, just for a second, before she forced a tight smile. You're just upset. It's understandable. But don't throw away everything you've built. I let her words sit between us, untouched. I had seen her true colors. I had heard her plan to trap me. I wasn't falling for it. The tension in the house became suffocating. Alex didn't bother pretending. He barely looked at me, and when he did, his gaze burned with contempt. Mrs. Whitmore, on the other hand, oscillated between fake sweetness and cold hostility. One moment, she'd ask about my day, forcing a smile. The next, she'd mutter just loud enough for me to hear, "Ungrateful woman," throwing away her family over pride. I ignored them both. They thought I was weak. They thought I was still the woman who would bow her head and accept their abuse. But I wasn't. I was done. And soon, they would realize it. The day of the hearing arrived. I stood outside the courtroom, my hands clenched into fists, my heart hammering against my ribs. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. I had spent years being afraid. Afraid of upsetting Alex, afraid of his mother's venomous words, afraid that I would never escape. But today, fear had no place in me. Today, I was ready. Inside the courtroom, Alex sat stiffly beside his lawyer, wearing a neatly pressed suit, his expression carefully schooled into one of quiet suffering. Mrs. Whitmore sat beside him, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, playing the role of the grieving, innocent mother-in-law who had been wronged by a selfish woman. Alex's lawyer stood and launched into a speech. Your Honor, my client is a devoted husband and father who has tirelessly provided for his family. This divorce is nothing more than an impulsive decision made by a wife who refuses to acknowledge the sacrifices he has made. My client wishes to reconcile, but Mrs. Evans, he gestured at me, purposefully avoiding my maiden name to paint me as the villain, is determined to break apart this family. I held my breath, waiting. I had expected this. I had prepared for it. When it was my turn, I rose slowly, locking eyes with the judge. Your Honor, I said, my voice calm, steady. Everything my husband just claimed is a lie. I turned, looking directly at Alex. He hasn't worked a day in years. I have been the sole provider for this family, paying every single bill, ensuring that our son is taken care of while being treated like a servant in my own home. Alex scoffed. That's not true. The judge raised a hand. Mr. Evans, you will not speak out of turn. Alex clenched his jaw, his knuckles white as he gripped the table. I continued. I have evidence, I said, pulling out the thick file I had prepared. Bank statements, pay stubs, utility bills, grocery receipts. Every single expense for the past 5 years has been covered by my salary. My husband and his mother have lived off of me while treating me like I was beneath them. The judge took the file, flipping through it. The weight in the room shifted. For the first time, Alex looked nervous. Then came the next blow. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. I also have recordings, I said, meeting the judge's gaze. Recordings of the verbal abuse I've endured. My lawyer played the clips. You're useless. No one else would put up with you. You're lucky we let you stay. The words echoed in the courtroom, each one sharper than the last. Mrs. Whitmore's face twisted in horror. Alex shot out of his chair. You were recording us? Sit down, Mr. Evans, the judge ordered. I stared at Alex, expression unreadable. You told me I was nothing without you, but now you're realizing that you're nothing without me. His mouth opened, then closed. Because he knew. I was right. And then my lawyer delivered the final, crushing blow. We would also like to present evidence of Mr. Evans' infidelity and Mrs. Whitmore's ongoing affair with her neighbor, Mr. Sinclair. The courtroom erupted. Gasps. Murmurs. People whispering to each other in shock. Alex's face went pale. What? His mother froze. My lawyer placed photos and documents on the table. Alex with another woman. Mrs. Whitmore sneaking around with Mr. Sinclair. Their shame was laid out for everyone to see. You invaded our privacy. Mrs. Whitmore screeched, her face flushed red with rage. I leaned forward, my voice cold. No. I exposed the truth. The judge called for order, then spoke, his voice final. The court grants full custody of the child to Mrs. Evans. Mr. Evans will receive no spousal support. The financial records provided prove that he has been dependent on his wife for the entirety of their marriage. The divorce is granted. It was over. They had lost. As I stepped out of the courtroom, the sun hit my face, warm and freeing. For the first time in years, I took a deep breath, one that didn't feel heavy. I looked down at my son, who reached up and took my hand. His small fingers curled around mine, his innocent eyes looking up at me. We're free now, aren't we, Mom? He whispered. I smiled. Yes, sweetheart. We are. And as we walked away, I knew this was just the beginning. The fallout was immediate. Word of the trial spread like wildfire, tearing through the small community like a storm. The people who once admired Alex and Mrs. Whitmore now whispered behind their backs, their judgmental stares relentless. Alex lost everything. His marriage, his home, and the last remnants of his reputation. No one saw him as the devoted husband he pretended to be in court. They saw the truth. A man who had leeched off his wife for years, who had cheated, who had been publicly exposed for the fraud he was. He tried to carry himself as if nothing had changed, but I knew better. The way he avoided eye contact, the way his shoulders hunched as he walked past familiar faces, it was the look of a man broken. Mrs. Whitmore had it worse. Her affair with Mr. Sinclair was the scandal of the year. The same people she used to gossip with now mocked her. The women she had once looked down on shunned her. Even Mr. Sinclair abandoned her, moving away to escape the humiliation. She was alone. One evening, as I was making dinner in my new home, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a woman standing there, Mrs. Harwood, the neighbor's wife. Her eyes were red, her hands clasped together tightly. "I had to come," she said softly. "I wanted to thank you." I frowned. "For what?" She swallowed hard. "For exposing them. I always had a feeling my husband was unfaithful, but I never had proof. You didn't just free yourself, Naomi. You saved me too." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time, they weren't tears of sorrow. They were of relief. I had never considered that my battle for freedom could have saved someone else. I reached out, squeezing her hand. "You deserve the truth." She nodded, letting out a shaky breath. "And so did you." A few weeks later, I ran into Alex. I had been leaving the bank when I spotted him sitting on a bench, staring blankly at the pavement. His clothes were wrinkled, his once-groomed hair disheveled. He looked up as I walked past. "Naomi," he called out. I almost didn't stop. Almost kept walking like he was nothing more than a ghost from my past. But something in his voice made me pause. I'm sorry," he said. His voice was weak, hollow. I stared at him. The man who once towered over me with arrogance now looked small. "I didn't realize how much I depended on you," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I took you for granted." I tilted my head, considering his words. And then I simply said, "I know." And I walked away. The last time I saw Mrs. Whitmore, it was in a grocery store. She was hunched over her cart, her face gaunt, her eyes sunken with exhaustion. She was alone. No admirers. No family. Nothing. She spotted me, and her lips curled into a sneer. "You did this to me," she hissed under her breath. I met her gaze, my expression unreadable. "No," I said calmly. "You did this to yourself." I left her standing there, her own words finally turned against her. I had spent years fighting to survive in their world. Now I was free. The best revenge? Living well. And for the first time in years, I was finally doing just that. The new house wasn't big. It wasn't fancy. But it was ours. As I set down the last moving box, I let out a deep breath, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. The walls weren't filled with hostility. The air wasn't thick with tension. This was home. My son ran through the empty living room, his laughter echoing. He climbed onto the couch and looked at me with wide, curious eyes. "Mom," he said softly, "are we going to be okay?" I knelt beside him, pulling him into my arms, feeling the warmth of his small body against mine. "We already are," I whispered. And I meant it. For years, I had been surviving, walking on eggshells, afraid to breathe too loudly, afraid to exist in a home that never felt like mine. But now? Now I was free. The true victory wasn't in watching Alex and his mother crumble. It wasn't in their downfall or their humiliation. It was this: a life without fear. A home where laughter replaced silence. A future where I no longer had to prove my worth because I already knew it. As the sun streamed through the window, casting a golden glow over the room, I smiled. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning.